In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome back to another Integrated Interventions podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Dundas, Director of Education with Integrated Interventions. And today's podcast is going to be focused on family resources, which is directly related to questions that have been asked to us by parents and guardians. And joining us today is Executive Director Chris Garrett and Clinical Director Joshua Westby.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. I appreciate it. You taking the time to answer some questions. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. This one is in relation to therapy, and being that you both are therapists, this will be right in your wheelhouse. So what types of therapy do we do?
It's a good question. When we talk about therapy at Integrated, it's very dynamic. So it depends on the needs of the student specifically. When we talk about individualized therapy, we can utilize a whole bunch of different modalities depending on what the student needs and what their diagnosis is, both here in the office, in the home, crisis de-escalation, in the community, really wherever the student needs to have that therapeutic presence, we can provide it.
Yeah, so it's quite a different approach to therapy that you'll find in other programs. We definitely want our students to engage in therapy, but we want it to be meaningful, and we want to remove the barrier, the obstacle of the therapist controlling the student's program. Oftentimes what we've seen coming out of other programs is that students work with a therapist, and the therapist has a lot of say in the day-to-day activities of the program, what the student should and shouldn't be doing, that sort of thing, and it creates this wall between the therapist and the student. Oftentimes you'll see students manipulating a therapist, or you'll see a therapist directing your day-to-day staff as to what they should or shouldn't be doing with your student. And we like to remove that barrier and have the student really grow to trust their therapist, find a therapist that works for them, and they can work on those specific issues that are addressed in therapy. And then we communicate with the therapist outside of that to the extent that the student is comfortable, so that we can continue to work on those aspects that they work on in therapy in the program as well. And that's where Joshua comes in many times in terms of that communication with a therapist or an outside therapist, depending on what the student chooses to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what is reality therapy and reality-based treatment?
Well, reality therapy is the idea that the client, or in our case, the student, is in control of the decisions that they make, and those decisions lead to the outcomes that they experience. And the idea is that if we can take ownership of our thoughts and ownership of our decisions, then the outcomes that we have will vary. We can see that a lot within the reality that we build for students within the program, where we can have real meaningful engagement with the student in a situation that they've put themselves, and provide actual feedback-based therapeutic intervention, where it's you chose to say this really mean thing and that person decided not to be your friend anymore. How are you going to process that? How are we going to move forward from that? And that conversation can happen on the couch in your house while the student's breaking down because they're feeling that loss of the relationship.
Yeah, when I think of reality therapy, I think of like what does a person do when they're experiencing difficult times in life, and they need to address that. Oftentimes, people will seek out a therapist and start attending therapy once a week. If it's something really intense that they're dealing with, they might go twice a week, but that's pretty intense. So you meet with a person for 45 minutes, and you talk about what's going on. You talk about coping skills, different interventions you might try, and then you report back the following week. We want to mimic that within our program. We want the student to experience what it's really like in life if you're struggling to have a therapist, not a therapist on call. That's not real life. None of us have a therapist on call that we can go to every day and bring up every little problem and have that therapist work through it with you. We have people in our lives, and we need to utilize the skills that we learn in therapy in the real world. So with our program, that's what we're mimicking. We're not here to try and create an unrealistic expectation for the student as they move forward in life that they're going to have a therapist on call. We want them to engage in therapy that one time a week, sometimes two if it's intense, and then take those skills into the real world and rely on mentors and other people in their life that spend more time with them to help get them through those difficult situations.
Yeah, and to Chris's point, when we look at our residential level of care in Texas, it's a little bit different. We have a therapist that's actually in the building for their entire 40 hours a week, where they can respond in real time to situations. and provide a higher level of therapeutic service because it's a higher level of care. So it's a little bit different than our traditional model where you're going to find the therapist working primarily for those hours or 2 hours a week with the student, either here in the office or in the community.
Yeah, and that's the goal there, is to help that young person transition into, kind of the next steps of being in their own place, and then utilizing therapy and backing off on that intensity over time, so that they can also get to that place of being independent and learning the skills of, okay, now I've gotten through this step in my life. Now I need to go out and interview some therapists and see who I can work with moving forward. So it's a pretty seamless transition as we go from that more intensive level of care in Texas to the less intensive levels of care.
Some parents really want to talk to a therapist so they can provide kind of extensive details about what therapy looks like with their particular student. What does the process look like with parent communication in relation to therapy? And why do parents usually not communicate with a therapist directly?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, as therapists, we're scientifically driven. We like data, we like information, we like previous testing. And parent insight is a very important part of the process when a student comes into the program to understand the full picture of where the student is at. However, we have opportunity to build real meaningful relationship with students where the student is the focus of the therapeutic process. And sometimes parents have a hard time because they want to be in that process with their student, and it's an intimate situation. It's just, there isn't any space. So in that regard, what's really helpful for parents is to be able to email a therapist and say, here's some thoughts that I had, or here's something that I thought about, and provide that feedback without it being a conversation, because we really want the student to be at the seat of who's involved in their therapeutic process, and have them, sometimes for the first time ever, really have control over that space and the relationship that they build with the therapist.
Yeah, I've seen lots of instances where students' parents have a better relationship with the therapist than the student. And oftentimes that invites the student to close down. If they feel like parents are driving the therapeutic process, that can be really upsetting to them, and they won't engage. Sometimes it's based on where they're at developmentally. They want to be obstinate because parents are talking to the therapist, I'm not going to. And sometimes it's because there are deeper family problems that they haven't necessarily addressed in the past that may come out at some point in therapy. And it may be a more appropriate time to bring parents in later in the process to help work through some of those family dynamics and family issues. And oftentimes we would refer out to another family therapist to do that work, so that we can maintain the relationship between the student and the parent. Piggybacking on Joshua, I love having information up front. I love talking to the parents about what they've seen work well and not work in the past, so we're not trying to recreate the wheel. But oftentimes it kind of ends at that point and move forward with the student, unless you get to a point where a statement is made or something comes up that directly involves the family. And then, at that point, the therapist is always welcome to get a release signed and then reach out to the family to clarify if that's what we need to do. We are custom fit, so there are times where parents are involved in the process, and that comes down to decisions made by our clinical team as to the appropriateness of that endeavor.
And it's different than the traditional care that a student's most likely going to have experienced before they came to integrated. So if parents have worked with programs in the past, they're going to be used to having direct access to a therapist, to have very clear understanding of the clinical oversight and interventions with their students. And so here, there's an adjustment period where parents have to be able to trust in the process and know that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, so their student can find some success and stand on their own 2 feet, which is going to carry them forward into that sustainable, independent living.
Well, and there's a parental communication piece too that can be a time for adjustment. Say if they're coming from an adolescent program where they're used to having more communication, and then they come here and we're versus multiple times a week, maybe we're talking to them once a week. Mm-hmm. And that can be a period of adjustment for them as well. Can you touch on that and your experiences with working with parents who are adjusting, coming from a different system of communication?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we typically like to do is recommend that parents have their own either parent coach or their own therapist to work through some of those harder issues. But it is definitely a big jump. With adolescent programs, oftentimes you're getting your weekly update from a therapist. Like that's the person assigned to talk to you, and they're providing insight into what's going on with your student. And that can feel really good, that you're getting all of that insight from a therapist. But in our program, you get your weekly updates from a coordinator, and the coordinator is the one that's spending, multiple hours a week with your student, talking with the mentors, training the mentors that are working with your student, and has insight into the actual day-to-day what's going on. So those come weekly. And then there's also opportunities to get updates from education, possibly from the therapy department, depending on your current situation. And then access to myself and Terry, if there's other things that come up. So we can touch, at times, multiple times a week, but the expectation is once a week with your coordinator.
And the updates, when they come from coordinators, they're more genuine to where a student is at. And I don't want to bash on other programs or communication styles. A therapist spends an hour, 2 hours a week with that student. The coordinator spends 40 hours a week with their students. And so it's going to be more direct feedback on where the student is, where they've struggled, where they've made progress. And it's going to be true to the application of the skills that we're building here so that they can carry them off into real life versus a therapist saying, they were engaged. Here's what we talked about for this 1 hour of the week.
How do you decide when it's time for a student to move forward, or how do you decide when it's time to raise the bar?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because we can look at it a couple of different ways. Because of the way the integrated is built, the clinical team doesn't decide where the bars are. That's not our place. We work with the student to understand the hurdles in front of them, how to get over them, how to process through them. We don't dictate where that progress is made or how fast it happens or where the bar gets moved to. That happens in our interdisciplinary team that's really driven by our coordinators who say, Johnny's having a really hard time engaging in interpersonal relationships in the workplace. And so we're going to raise the bar by encouraging Johnny to make 3 friends in the community and support that process. And then we can pull that into the therapeutic work and work with Johnny to understand the importance of relationship building and how to sustain healthy relationships and those things. But ultimately, the student decides where those bars are because as they naturally progress through the program, they start to show the areas where they have deficits. And then that's where integrated puts its focus.
Yeah, a lot of times we hear from parents and education consultants, different people in the students' lives, like the question of when is this student supposed to graduate? When do you think they're going to graduate from the program? And that question always, it sets me back a little bit. We don't have a graduation process. Nobody graduates from our program with like a ceremony or something along those lines. Really graduating from our program is demonstrating the ability to stand on your own 2 feet to the best of your ability. We have some students that will always need help. They'll need continuing care, and we can help assess that while they're here. And we have other students that come in, engage in the process, and as we raise the bar, as they raise the bar for themselves, they're able to meet their expectations, and they move into their own place, or they move to a different city, or they go to college somewhere. They move on. That's graduating our program, demonstrating the ability to keep yourself safe, to engage in meaningful work, to engage in continued learning and education if that's your path, and really to have a kind of a clear set of goals and things that you're working towards, and let us help you build a process to get there. And really what we're looking for is for them to demonstrate that they're capable of doing that. Once they've demonstrated the capability and show that they can sustain it, they're ready to move on. So that's really how we gauge that. We utilize spiral dynamics, on a more sophisticated level. If you're looking at where the person is operating well and where they're not operating well in their lives, we can use spiral dynamics to really piece that out into different parts of the individual.
Yeah, I think about a career or going to school, right? Education. You start off to get your bachelor's degree, and on the first day, you have 4 years in front of you, and it feels really daunting and overwhelming. And then before you know it, you're 2 days before graduation, you're like, holy cow, how did I get here so fast, right? I didn't even realize that I was busting through classes and doing all this work and summer vacations and all the stuff. I'm almost done. Integrated feels the same way for our students, where they show up and they don't really know where they're going, and they're wandering, off into the ether. And then a year later, 18 months later, they're like, wow, I haven't talked to a mentor in 8 days. I'm going to work on my own. I was able to call the pharmacy and refill my own prescription. My job is going awesome. I don't think I need you anymore. And it happens so organically that we get to that point and then we get to celebrate with you and be like, yeah, you're right. You really don't need us anymore. Let's look at this final step. How do we get an apartment on our own? How do we get around the community on our own? Are there any resources we're going to have for the rest of our lives to make sure that we can be sustainable? Like a therapist or a financial consultant, things like that. And then they're off. And so it's different for everybody because we're really raising students to be adults. And that process is unique to every individual.
So the following statements have been taken directly from conversations that were had with parents and guardians. So please address each one of these statements as I read them. My kid is a complete mess and can never be left alone. How do you get them to not be a mess?
Yeah. Can they not be left alone because they're a danger to themselves or others? Can they not be left alone because they'll make a mess? What does that look like? Right. Clinically speaking, if a student is safe to be left alone, that we're not fearful of themselves or others, then we're going to probably leave you alone and see what kind of mess you create, because then we're going to work through how to not make it a mess anymore. For those students who could potentially be a risk to themselves or others, or are showing depressive symptoms where they'll isolate and they'll spend 14, 18 hours in their bedroom by themselves, we're going to apply more intervention there and make sure that they're supported. And then we're going to take away that scaffolding over time as they need it less.
Yeah, and another piece to that too is we really like to train our staff and focus on working on ourselves as well. So it's not all just about the student in the program. We have mentors that are interacting with them every day, and we train our staff to create a good life balance, right? So we want the people coming into the house to be able to demonstrate this ability to take care of yourself. So if you feel like your student is a complete mess or struggles in multiple areas, we're going to start working from the ground up on that. We're going to identify which areas they're struggling with the most and put more emphasis on those areas of their life. And the areas that they've got down, locked down, we're not going to spend as much time on that. And so if it's hygiene or if it's suicidal ideation or whatever it is, we're going to focus on those areas first and build them up so that we can move on to other areas later.
My student has a sex addiction because they look at pornography.
Yeah, lots of people do, especially young people. And it's okay. Like that doesn't mean the student can't come to our program. If it's something that's hurtful to the student, or it's causing them to treat others poorly, or some of the outside peripheral things that come along with a statement like that, we're going to be working on those things. So let's just take, for example, you have a student that comes in that treats women really poorly, and they've learned how to treat women by watching pornography online. Well, we're going to have mentors working with that student, male and female, who are correcting those actions or those words that are coming out of the student's mouth, and teaching them in real time, setting boundaries, the right way to treat other people. So that's how we address those things. And oftentimes, if it's a real fear that it's an addiction, that's something that's going to be addressed in therapy with a therapist.
My student is a drug addict because they smoked pot.
Yeah, this follows kind of those same lines. So we operate on a harm reduction model. So we want to make sure that we are providing the most safe space to have the ability to make different decisions, right? So when we talk about addiction, especially drug addiction, that as a clinical diagnosis, that could be very different than how it's displayed, right? Your student smoking pot every day because they're bored, have nothing else to do, is a lot different than somebody who can't do X, Y, and Z without a drug, right? And so within our program, we're going to spend a lot of time in the behavior modification area, just like we would with the sex piece and the pornography, of working with the student to say, yeah, you could spend $80 and go get high on a Friday night and have fun. Or we can do something that's A, legal in the state of Idaho, B, doesn't take $80 so you can pocket some of that money, and C, is more socially acceptable, right? Because it's not socially acceptable, at least in our community, to get high on a Friday night and run around downtown. There are other options there, right? So we're going to help a student to start to piece together what those options can be. Oftentimes with the population that we work with, substance use, particularly pot, usually alcohol as well, it's a social behavior. They've learned it because their friend group was, or because they were an outcast in high school, and that's what the other outcasts in high school were doing. We want to help to teach what other options there are available to the student.
There's not enough carrot and there's too much stick in this program.
Well, I was joking with Joshua. Nobody likes carrots anyways. But that's a tough statement, right? We really focus on natural consequences in our program. we don't set up a sticker program or a rewards program for our students. We want the rewards to be natural and earned, because that's what happens in life. If, you know, my mom hasn't given me a gold star or any kind of reward for any of my accomplishments in the last 20 years. And that's okay. When we think about spiral dynamics and our levels of functioning, one of the areas that we're trying to get students to is to be motivated by some external rewards that come through natural consequences. If you're working in a job and you're motivated to be in charge of other people and you get something out of that, it builds your ego, right? You're going to want to go to work every day and work hard so that you can be promoted to manager. That's a huge accomplishment. That's a great carrot. That's a real carrot. That's what people are working towards. So we promote that. If you're going to your job and you do a terrible job and they decide to cut your hours back or write you up, well, there's the stick. And that's a pretty big stick. If you lose your job, you lose your source of income. Now you have to go back and maybe work at the farm for a couple of weeks for the program and relearn how to engage with people so you don't get fired at your next job. Yeah, that's a big stick, but that's what happens in life. If you get fired from your job, you don't get to go in necessarily and just say, hey, you shouldn't fire me. You know, it made me really sad. Well, too bad, you weren't performing well, so you had to be let go. So yeah, we have stick in this program, but it's natural consequences. It's not stuff that we make up. The interventions that we do employ are reality-based interventions, and we try to mimic real life as much as possible. If real life isn't hitting them hard enough with the stick, we can mimic some of that. But we also want to really promote the carrot side, which is work hard and earn the things that are coming into your life. You'll feel better about it. It's more real.
Yeah, and I was joking before we started filming, we were going through the questions, that being an adult is a lot of stick. There's not a lot of carrot to being a human, right? A productive member of society, which is true, right? We deal with a lot of stress, our children and jobs and car breaking down and all the things of life. But also, the carrots are meaningful because they're meaningful to us, right? Because we've designed life to be fulfilling in the way that we find fulfillment. And we want our students to be able to find that fulfillment for themselves, which isn't going to be by us manufacturing and giving them carrots. A really interesting scientific study was done a couple of years ago where they looked at video game play. And when you use a cheat code to get all the resources unlocked in a video game, the number of hours you'll play that video game after that diminishes drastically, right? Because you've gotten all the carrots. Why would you continue engaging? We want to work with students not to get them to start chasing the carrots and collect them, but to recognize that in the real world, life sucks sometimes and we make poor decisions sometimes and things don't go our way sometimes. And instead of focusing on that, we can make different choices so that we can feed ourselves those carrots, right? That we found for ourselves.
Yeah, I read a pretty cool book a couple of years ago. It's called No Mud, No Lotus, right? And really what it boils down to is, you know, you're looking at a lotus flower and what it has to go through to become a beautiful lotus flower. And they grow in thick, gross, disgusting mud. And they have to fight and struggle to survive and get to the point where they can actually blossom and bloom. I look at life the same way. You know, we have to work through the difficult times to build character. And we want all of our students to build character while they're here. And without adversity, without the stick, without the real life things that we all have to struggle through, you're not going to build character. You know, if it's all roses and rewards every time you do something, you're really not going to be beaten down enough to be able to build yourself into something better and greater. So that's really our focus. It's not to be mean to people. We want them to struggle through real life things so that they can build a better person out of themselves and move forward that way.
Yeah, and understanding the weight of the sticks. You're going to learn really quickly the weight of the criminal justice system if you touch on it. If you do something that gets you a citation and you have to go to court and pay a fine, that's going to teach a lesson significantly better than me saying, if you choose to jaywalk, you may get a ticket. Right? I want you to experience that. And then I want to have a conversation around how do we make sure that we don't put ourselves in this position in the future, knowing that we did not like the consequence that we just went through with the stick that the community gave.
Yeah. Or there's that concept of, hey, don't do anything illegal this week. Don't physically assault somebody and I will give you, an extra $10 on your food card so you can buy a bunch of candy at the end of the week. There's nothing real life about that. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't be assaulting people because if you do assault people, you go to jail. And that needs to be an understanding with a lot of our students and population that are used to being rescued from those situations. If you're out on the street and you assault somebody, chances are really good that you're going to be talking to an officer and at minimum get a citation and have to show up in court. And most likely you're going to spend a night in jail. So we don't want to shelter students to the point where they're not experiencing what's going to happen in life. It actually harms them. It makes life more difficult when they're finally slapped with it.
What do you mean when there is a difference between acceptance of a behavior and tolerance of a behavior?
A lot of times that comes down, and I know a lot of parents talk to Terry about this as well. We can tolerate a lot of behaviors. Pretty much any behavior that comes at us as a program, we can tolerate that. It doesn't mean we accept the behavior, right? So, but it also doesn't mean that we set up arbitrary boundaries or rules around a behavior. Typically what we're talking about is like assaultive behavior. We'll have a student that comes in that has a history of assaulting staff members or assaulting their peers, and they're free to do that, right? Like other programs, if you do that, they might put you in an isolation room and lock the door, and it's almost a weird type of prison type situation. But with us, if you assault somebody, then we're looking at natural consequences, right? We're not restraining anybody. We're not putting people in holds or holding them down and that sort of thing. So we can tolerate behavior. We won't kick your student out because they're acting out or they have negative behaviors. We'll do our best to work with that student to change those behaviors. And oftentimes that takes months of the behavior happening before a change starts to take place. So we tolerate the behavior for months. It doesn't mean we accept it, and we definitely don't encourage it, but we will tolerate that process because changing a behavior is always a process. It's not something that happens overnight and typically doesn't even happen in a couple months. It takes a long time to change a behavior, and you have to want to.
Yeah, and this is such an awesome question. And when I think about this question and application, right? Let's say we have a student named Jimmy, and every morning Jimmy punches a hole in his wall, in the drywall. And we've worked with Jimmy to understand that it costs $15 to repair the hole in the drywall, and we've gone through all that work. We can tolerate holes in the drywall indefinitely. It's not hard to patch. But we're not going to accept it, right? If a brand new staff shows up to work with Jimmy and Jimmy punches a hole in the wall, the staff that's worked with Jimmy for months isn't going to say, well, that's just Jimmy. That's what he does. Right? We're going to continue to work on these are the consequences of this decision. Here's how this affects other people. Here's how we can make change so that we don't do this in the future. Right? We've tolerated the behavior, but we're not going to accept it as just being a part of them as a human being that's never going to change. Right? The student is at the wheel of when and how that changes, but that doesn't mean that we have to just accept it as being their truth indefinitely.
Yeah, and natural consequences play a big part in that, because if a person punches a hole in the wall, they're typically the one responsible for either paying for it to be fixed or helping fix it themselves. So they've got some skin in the game, and that's true in real life. If I punch a hole in the wall at my house, I'm going to be the one paying to get it fixed, or I'm going to be finding somebody that can show me how to fix it myself, and I'm going to learn a new skill. So those are the types of things that we focus on with students that are acting out like that.
Next question is in relation to spiral dynamics. Our student is 100% level 3 red at all times.
Yeah, that's impossible.
Yep.
So, and that's a weird way to put it, but so level 3, and oftentimes what parents are referring to is that their student is very impulsive, right? They make impulsive choices and act on them often. And that can be true in a lot of areas. I could definitely see a student that comes into our program that operates in that red space a lot, but it's never true that they're always there. Just the fact that they came to our program shows some level of operating in a more blue or 4 range of operations, because they had to agree to come here. And at least somewhere in that process, they agreed that this was going to be good for them and provide the right structure for them to move forward. And that's not an impulsive level of thinking. So it's just not possible to operate in 3 at all times. And with spiral dynamics, we're always moving from one level to another and then back down again. So there's going to be fluctuation in that. And as a team, we're trained on how to identify where they're at in the moment and help push them in a direction that's going to be more helpful for them in the future, and be okay with them if they slide back down into that lower level of functioning. Because we understand that that's what happens. That's life. That's humans. We're not the same all the time, every day. Things happen. So.
Yeah, and it can be really nuanced as well, because there's the outward behavior, the symptom, and then there's the inward thought process. And sometimes a student who is impulsive all the time is actually magically thinking, right? They're more purple or level 2 because they believe that if they do this behavior long enough, it's going to get them kicked out of the program, or somebody will give them more carrots, or whatever that truth is for them. But that manifests as impulsive or rude or mean or aggressive. But that doesn't mean that they're operating in that level all the time. It's a defense mechanism that they're utilizing. So they're bouncing back and forth between that purple and red, believing that it's going to rescue them from the situation that they found themselves. It takes time to kind of find that comfortability to recognize that you're not getting rescued. And then that shift from purple to red leads to the thoughts between red and blue, which typically leads to more negative behaviors as we start to figure out how we're going to find consistency and meaning in our life for the long term.
Yeah, I've also seen students really plan out their red behaviors ahead of time, which technically doesn't make them red behaviors, but it presents as a red behavior. You know, you'll have a student that decides to go out and get 3 bank accounts that week and overdraw 2 of them so they have enough money to do X, Y, and Z. And on the surface, it looks like, well, 3 days this week, they just went out on a whim and opened a bank account. That wasn't the case. They knew exactly what they were doing ahead of time, and they executed their plan and received the natural consequence, which might be a worse credit score. It might be bank accounts being shut down and not being able to do that in the future. But they also got their needs met in the moment and were able to withdraw too much money. Yeah, there's going to be consequences down the road, and they weren't thinking about those consequences, but they definitely planned out the behavior. That's a pretty structured level of thinking. And if we can identify that, we can help that student generalize it to other areas that are going to be more helpful. So oftentimes, you know, if we're looking at that, they're red all the time. No, they're probably planning a lot of that out. And we might need to tap into their ability to plan those things out and point it in a better direction.
And that's a big part of the clinical piece of our program. We don't treat symptoms, right? We look for the underlying causes of the symptoms. If you get mad and punch a hole in your wall every day, there's a reason for that. I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about the holes in the wall. I want to start talking about the steps before that hole that's causing the hole in the wall. And so with our students, if a student comes in and is red in all areas all of the time, I don't really care about how that manifests. I care, why is that where we're at currently? And what can we do to look at it differently so that we don't have to be there anymore?
On to our next question is, I'm their primary parent, and my student only trusts me because we have a unique and special relationship. I'm the only person that can help my student move forward.
I'm not going to say false again, but that's false.
Codependency.
Yeah. And we do hear that. And I understand, I would hope that a parent has a special relationship with their student, with their kid. That makes sense to me. But you have to make sure that that's not getting in the way of them moving forward. You can have a special relationship with your student, and other people can also help your student. And you should be encouraging your student to build relationships with other people and trust other people, and be pulling back as a parent at that point in their life. In terms of that, I'm here to take care of you. Well, that's not your role anymore. You're becoming, your child is becoming a young adult, and they need to learn how to be an adult. So they need to be taking care of themselves as much as humanly possible. And your relationship should start to change and morph into something that's more adult to adult, healthy, friendly with your student. And the program takes the place of that special relationship where they'll only listen to you. That can be a real problem, especially in the first 30 days. If we're doing that blackout period where there's no communication in that first 30 days, and they only depend on communicating with their parent, that could be a really big struggle, right? But we need to start severing some of those ties early on in treatment so that we can get more traction as a program. I'd hate to send my student to an expensive program somewhere, expecting them to do a lot of really great work when I'm the only one that can work with my student. That doesn't make any sense to me. If you truly believe that, you probably shouldn't have sent your student here, because you're the only one that can get through to them. They should be working with you. If you don't want to be that person, that's where your own personal work comes in. And you want to have that better, more healthy relationship, more adult relationship with your child, and let the program take over on the other side.
Yeah, and it's important too that it takes a lot of trust for parents to get to that point. And we don't blame parents for having that desire to keep their child safe, right? That's what we want for all of our children. The biggest thing that we look at is that a student has to be sustainable in the long term, and they have to be able to utilize services outside of the relationship that they have with their parents, which can be daunting and overwhelming, especially for parents who have been holding this ship together for a long time. And to Chris's point, if genuinely parents are the only person who can affect change, there is no reason for your student to come to our program. We won't be able to do anything with that. However, we have thousands and thousands of hours, decades of experience in this area so that we can provide interventions and feedback for students that they aren't getting at home. And that's no fault of parents, right? We're the experts in this. We've spent a lot of time. We don't expect parents to be experts in this, right? We expect parents to be there to celebrate the wins and to mourn the losses with their student, just like they would their neighbor, their best friend, somebody at work, and have that relationship. We want parents to be the first person a student wants to call when they get a promotion. But we also don't want a student to call mom every time something is uncomfortable, because that's just not sustainable for the student or the parent in the long term.
Yeah, it's kind of a re-education period for both the student and the parent. And finally, we need a program that is clinically sound, one that has a lot of therapists, psychiatrists, and nurses to tell us about our student. Basically, we want a medical model, hospital setting, but we don't want our student in the hospital. We want them in the community. There's a lot of moving pieces to this statement.
Yeah, and it starts with the only thing you learn in a hospital model is how to live within a hospital model. When we talk about adolescent residential care, you learn how to live within a system that can give you consequence, which is really great if when you turn 18, you're going to leave a residential model and go to prison or the military, because they're the two only places you're going to find that level of care. When we talk about hospitalizations or the hospital model, it's the same thing. If every time I'm sad, I have to talk to a therapist, that's going to get really expensive really quickly and isn't sustainable for the normal person, right? I can't call a therapist every time I'm uncomfortable, but I can have my 1 hour a week where I can talk about the themes in my life that are causing discomfort. And so when we look at what integrated does, we're not a hospital model on purpose. We don't want to set up a student to think that that's how the real life works, because it just isn't. However, we utilize an interdisciplinary team that includes clinical therapists, psychiatry, nursing, case management, and all the other pieces that we can bring to the table so that we can have a well-rounded approach that feels very genuine to real life. And a student may not even realize all the time that goes into their particular life in any given week that's happening behind the scenes.
Chris, anything to add to that?
No.
I think Joshua did a great job of summing that up.
Yeah, nailed it.
Awesome. Well, this will be a continuing segment because there are only so many questions that we can get in a traditional podcast time. But I'd like to thank both of you once again for joining us and talking a little bit more about some of the questions and comments, statements, concerns that we received directly from parents. I think it's also helpful as well because some parents may have some similar questions, and to be able to have a podcast that addresses those can be helpful and important to have as a resource.
All right. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you. My name is Patrick Dundas. I've been the host of Integrated Interventions Podcast. Make sure to visit us on the web. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and all the things that come along with being a participant in the social media world. Until next time, this has been another Integrated Interventions Podcast. Thanks again.